In this episode, we'll be listening to Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich as she shares her visions about the life of the Blessed Virgin Mary after Christ's ascension. We include Mary's Holy Way of the Cross near Ephesus, the apostles' arrival to be present at the Blessed Virgin's death, and the death, burial, and assumption of the Blessed Virgin. We are happy to share this with you for our 200th episode of Truth of the Spirit. Our past 200 episodes span facets of abundant living as Christians, Catholic formation, about the basics of faith, witness stories, and explanations of teachings of the Catholic Church. We have covered, discerned prophetic information, and offered various tools and prayers for healing and so much more. We present action, teaching, and prayer. Welcome to Truth of the Spirit and Mary's Last Days, as experienced by Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich. I'm your host, Patti Brunner, and I'll be sharing from Blessed Anne's journal, recorded by Clement Brentano and edited by Very Rev. C.E. Schmöger, that was published in 1914. As for all private revelation, we invite your discernment. We also invite you to check out our playlist on Blessed Anne Catherine on our free YouTube Truth of the Spirit channel, or on our website, patriarchministries.com, where our past episodes have included Blessed Anne's visions about St. Joseph, the Nativity, the First Eucharist, Pentecost, and so much more. As I read from the journal, I will speak in the first person as Blessed Anne Catherine shares her visions of the life of Mary after Christ's ascension. And Catherine Emmerich reports that the Blessed Virgin went with John to the neighborhood of Ephesus. Blessed Anne Catherine says, about 1 year after the crucifixion of our Lord, Stephen was stoned, though no further persecution of the apostles took place at that time. The rising settlement of new converts around Jerusalem, however, was dissolved. The Christians dispersed, and some were murdered. A few years later, a new storm rose against them. Then it was that the Blessed Virgin, who until that time had dwelt in the small house near the Calicum and in Bethania, allowed herself to be conducted by John to the region of Ephesus, where the Christians had already made settlements. This happened a short time after the imprisonment of Lazarus and his sisters by the Jews, and their setting out over the sea. John returned again to Jerusalem, where the other apostles still were. James the Greater was one of the first of the apostles who, after the division of the different countries had been made, left Jerusalem and started for Spain. I saw him on his departure in Bethlehem, where he concealed himself in the crib cave, and then with his companions, secretly wandering through the country, for there were spies in search of them with orders to prevent their leaving Palestine. But James had friend in Joppa, and he succeeded in embarking. He sailed first to Ephesus in order to visit Mary, and thence to Spain. Shortly before his death, he visited Mary and John a second time in their home at Ephesus. Here, Mary told him that his death would soon take place in Jerusalem. She encouraged and consoled him. James took leave of her and his brother John and started for Jerusalem. It was at this period that he was brought into contact with Hermogenes and his pupil, both of whom he converted by his miracles. James was several times apprehended and taken before the synagogue. I saw that shortly before Easter, when he was preaching on a hill in an open square of Jerusalem, he was arrested. It must have been about this time, for I saw the customary encampments around the city. James was not imprisoned long. He was sentenced to death in the same place of trial as Jesus. The whole place, however, had undergone a change. Those sites upon which Jesus had trodden were no longer in existence, and I have always thought that none other ever after trod the same. I saw James led out towards Mount Calvary. He continued his preaching all along the way and thereby made many converts. When they bound his hands, he remarked, "You can bind my hands, but ye cannot bind the blessing. Ye cannot bind my tongue." A lame man was sitting by the roadside. He called to James, begging him to extend his hand and help him. James responded, "Come thou to me, and reach out thy hand to me." The lame man arose, seized the fettered hands of the apostles, and was cured. I saw also the man that had denounced him. He was named Josias. His heart smote him. He hurried to the apostle and begged forgiveness. He declared himself for Christ and was likewise put to death. James asked him whether he desired baptism, and when Josiah answered yes, he embraced and kissed him, saying, "Thou wilt be baptized in thy blood." I saw a woman running with her blind child to James on the place of execution and imploring its restoration to sight. James was at first stationed near Josias on an elevated place, and the sentence proclaimed aloud. Then he was laid on a large stone, his hands bound to it, his eyes blindfolded, and his head struck off. This took place in the 12th year after Jesus' death, or between 46 and 47 after the birth of Christ. I did not see James present at the death of the Blessed Virgin in Ephesus. There was another in his place, a relative of the Holy Family and one of the first among the 72 disciples. Mary died in the year 48 after the birth of Christ, 13 years and 2 months after Christ's ascension. This was shown to me in numbers, not in writing. First, I saw IV, then VII, which denoted the year 48. And lastly, I saw XIII, and 2 full months. The Blessed Virgin's dwelling was not in Ephesus itself, but from 3 to 4 hours distant. It stood on a height upon which several Christians from Judea, among them some of the holy women related to her, had taken up their abode. Between this height and Ephesus glided, with many a crooked curve, a little river. The height sloped obliquely toward Ephesus. From the southeast, one beheld the city as if lying just before him at the foot of a mountain, but on nearer approach he found the latter stretching still further away. From Ephesus, before which I saw great avenues with yellow fruit strewing the ground, narrow footpaths led up to this wild, overgrown height, upon which, to the circumference of about an hour, stretched a very solitary but fertile plain, covered with smooth-trunked, wide-spreading trees, and containing clean, rocky caves. These latter had, by means of light woodwork, been converted into hermitages by the early Christian settlers who had fled thither for refuge. These abodes, along with others that stood alone, scattered here and there over the whole country, gave the region the appearance of a little village. From the top of this elevated plain, which was nearer to the sea than Ephesus, one could see both the city itself and the sea with its numerous islands. Not very far from the Christian settlement rose a castle whose occupant appeared to be a deposed king. John often visited him and finally converted him. At a later period, this place became a bishopric. Among the Christians settled here, I saw women, children, and some men. Not all of these people had interaction with the Blessed Virgin. Only some holy women came now and then for a visit or to render her some assistance, for they saw to her needs. The locality was very retired and seldom visited by anyone, for no highway ran through it. The people of Ephesus did not trouble themselves about the little colony, and so they lived as if forgotten. The soil was fruitful, and the settlers owned some gardens and orchards. The only animals I saw in this place were wild goats. Before John brought the Blessed Virgin to this settlement, he had built for her a dwelling of stone, very similar to her own at Nazareth. It stood among trees and was divided into 2 apartments by the fireplace in the center. The fire was on the earth opposite the entrance, in a kind of furnace formed by the wall, which rose up on either side like steps to the roof of the house. In it was cut the flue from which the smoke escaped through a tube that protruded above the flat roof. The front room of the house was separated from the back by wicker screens placed on either side of the fireplace. Similar screens rested against the walls, right and left, the whole length of the house. They were used to form little apartments when needed, and could be easily put aside when the room was to be used as one. Mary's maidservant used one of them as a sleeping apartment, and the others were occupied by the holy women of the settlement when they happened to come on a visit of some length. To the right and left, on either side of the fireplace, light doors opened through the wicker partition into the 2 back rooms, whose end walls were rounded and very pleasing to the eye, covered as they were with neatly wrought woodwork. The roof was rounded on the sides, and the beams above it were bound with wainscoting and twisted work and ornamented with some simple imitation of foliage. In the most remote space of the rounded inn, Mary had her oratory, before which hung a curtain. Here, in a niche in the wall, was a kind of closet, which, like a certain kind of tabernacle, could be made to open and close by revolving. In it was a crucifix about the length of one's arm. The arms were set into the trunk in an obliquely raised direction, like that of Christ. This most simply carved crucifix was, I think, made by the Blessed Virgin herself and John. It was constructed of 3 different kinds of wood. The widest trunk was cypress wood. One arm was a brownish color, cedar. The other was yellowish. It was made from the wood of the palm tree. The top piece that supported the inscription was of polished yellow olive wood. The foot of the crucifix was set firmly in a stone, like Christ in the rock of Calvary. At its foot lay a strip of parchment on which were inscribed some words of the Savior. The figure representing the Lord was formed simply of dark-colored lines cut into the cross. On either side of the crucifix there stood a pot of flowers. I saw also lying near the cross a little linen, of which I had the intuitive knowledge that it was the one with which the Blessed Virgin, after taking down of the sacred body from the cross, had cleansed the wounds from blood. For as soon as I saw the little cloth, I had a vision of that exercise of her most sacred mother love, in which she held the little linen in the same way as does the priest at the Holy Mass when he is purifying the chalice. Mary had a similar crucifix, though only half as large, in the alcove in which she slept. On the right of the oratory and against the rounded wall was the alcove of the Blessed Virgin. It was formed into two lightly woven screens of sapwood in its natural color. These stood at the head and the foot of the couch, respectively. In front hung two curtains of tapestry that could be drawn and looped to either side. The couch was placed along the wall, which too was hung with tapestry. It was the length and breadth of a small bed, and consisted of a wooden frame about 1.5 feet high. Over it a tester was stretched, and fastened on the knobs of the four corners. The sides of the frame also were covered with tapestry, which hung down to the floor and was fringed with tassels. A round roll served as a pillow. The cover was brownish checkered stuff. The ceiling of this little sleeping apartment was the loftiest in the house. It too was formed of wicker work, and from the four corners to the center ran up the concave dome, from which was suspended a branched lamp. Here, on the last days before her death, I saw the Blessed Virgin lying entirely enveloped in a white sleeping sheet. Even her arms were wound up in it. The veil over her head was thrown up in cross-folds, but when conversing with men she lowered it. Even her hands were uncovered only when she was alone. During those last days I did not see her taking anything except the juice of a grape-like fruit with yellow berries, which the maid pressed out for her into a little cup. By the wall, to the left of the oratory, and directly opposite the alcove, a recess was formed by means of wicker screens, in which clothes and other things were kept. Besides some veils and girdles and the upper garment that Mary always wore when making the Holy Way of the Cross, there hung in that recess 2 long robes, one white, the other sky blue. The latter was a very delicate blue, and there was likewise a mantle of the same color. This was the robe in which Mary was married to Joseph. I saw too that Mary kept near her many of the garments of her divine Son, among them his woven tunic. From that recess to the alcove extended a curtain by which the oratory could be concealed. When at work, Mary used to sit before this curtain and just between the recess and the alcove. In this most secret and solitary little dwelling, from which the abodes of the other settlers would distance about 1/4 hour, lived the Blessed Virgin, alone with her maid, who procured for her the little that she needed for her support. There was no man in the house, and only at times was Mary visited by John or some other traveling apostle and disciple. Once I saw John entering the house. He was thin and looked older. He wore a long white garment girdled in folds, which was now tucked up. He laid it aside on entering, and taking out another from under his mantle, put it on instead. There was an inscription in letters on this second one. He laid a maniple on his arm. The Blessed Virgin was in a little private room, from which the maid conducted her to John. She was enveloped in a white robe and looked very weak. Her face was, as it were, transparent and white as snow. She appeared to be soaring upward on the wings of her ardent desires. Her whole life after her son's ascension into heaven was stamped by an ever increasing longing to be freed from earth. She retired with John to her oratory, pulled a band or strap upon which the tabernacle in the niche revolved, and disclosed the crucifix of the length of one's arm, standing between two vases of natural flowers. After Mary and John had prayed long on their knees before the crucifix, the latter arose and took from a metal box a roll of fine woolen stuff. Opening this, he took out a small piece of white bread in shape four-cornered that was carefully folded in white linen cloths. It was the most blessed sacrament, with which some words he gave to Mary. He presented her no cup. Another vision of Blessed Anne Catherine was Mary's Holy Way of the Cross near Ephesus. In the neighborhood of her dwelling, Anne Catherine says, the Blessed Virgin had herself erected the stations of the Holy Way of the Cross. I saw her at first going alone and measuring off all the special points of the bitter passion according to the number of steps which, after the death of her son, she had so often counted. At the end of each definite number, she raised a memorial stone in remembrance of the special suffering there endured by her divine Son. I saw her with a sharp instrument, a stylus, recording there what had taken place and how many steps it was to it. If a tree happened to be standing on that particular spot, she marked it as one of the stations, on which there were 12. The way led to a grove, and there was the Holy Sepulchre represented by a cave in the side of the hill. After all the stations were definitively marked, the Blessed Virgin made the Holy Way with her maid in silent meditation. When they reached a station, they sat down, meditated upon its mystery and its signification, and prayed. By degrees, the whole route was improved and more beautifully arranged. John gave orders for regular monuments to be set up. I saw also the cave representing the sepulchre being cleared out and made more suitable for prayer. The memorial stones lay in hollows of greater or less depth, which were covered with grass and flowers and surrounded by a hedge. They were of polished white marble. The thickness of the underlying surface could not be seen on account of the grass. The faithful, when performing this devotion, carried a cross about a foot in length, with a support which they placed in the little hollow on the upper surface of the store while they were meditating, either kneeling or prostrate on their face. The path that ran in a hollow around the stone was wide enough for 2 persons to walk side by side. There were 12 such stones. When the devotion was ended, each was covered with a mat. The sides and base of all bore similar inscriptions in Hebrew letters, Hebrew characters, but the hollow places in which they rested differed, some being larger, some smaller. The first station, or that of the Mount of Olives, was in a little vale. There was a small cave in it in which several could kneel together. The Mount Calvary station was the only one not in a hollow. It was on a hill. For that of the Holy Sepulchre, one had to cross another hill on which opposite sides stood the memorial stone in a hollow. Thus, one descended to the foot of the hill and into the tomb itself, in which later on Mary's remains rested. I think this tomb is still in existence under the surface of the earth, and that it will come to light someday. Whenever I saw Mary making the holy way of the cross, she wore an overgarment that fell in folds down the back as far as the feet. It was laid over the shoulders and was fastened under the collar by a button. It was girded around the waist, thus taking in the brownish underdress. It appeared to be a festal robe, for in accordance with ancient Jewish customs, a similar one had also been worn by Anne. Her hair was concealed under a yellowish cap, which was pointed on the forehead and gathered together in folds at the back of the head. A black veil, a soft material, hung down far below the waist. In this dress I saw her making the way of the cross. She had worn it at the crucifixion under the mantle of prayer, of mourning, which entirely enveloped her, and she wore it now only when performing this devotion. When at work in the house, she laid it aside. The Blessed Virgin was now very advanced in years, but she had in her appearance no other mark of age than that of great longing, which at length effectuated her glorification. She was inexpressibly grave. I never saw her laugh. The older she grew, the whiter and more transparent became her face. She was thin, but I saw no wrinkle, no sign of decay in her. She was like a spirit. Once I saw the Blessed Virgin and 5 other women making the holy way, along which she went first. She was perfectly white and transparent, indescribably touching to look upon. It seemed to me that she was now making the devotion for the last time. Among the holy women who were praying with her, there were several that had become acquainted with her in the first year of Jesus' teaching. One was a relative of the prophetess Anna, and another was the granddaughter of a maternal aunt of Elizabeth. I saw 2 of the women making the way of the cross by turns every morning and evening. Blessed Anne Catherine received the vision of Mary's visits to Jerusalem. Anne Catherine said, after Mary had lived 3 years in the settlement near Ephesus, she conceived a great desire to visit Jerusalem. So John and Peter escorted her thither. Several apostles were there assembled, of whom I remember Thomas. I think it was a council, and Mary assisted the apostles with her advice. On her arrival, I saw her in the evening twilight, visiting, before she entered the city, the Mount of Olives, Mount Calvary, the Holy Sepulchre, and all the holy places around Jerusalem. The Mother of God was so sad, so moved by compassion, that she could scarcely walk. Peter and John supported her under the arms. A year and a half before her death, she made one more journey from Ephesus to Jerusalem, and I saw her again visiting the holy places. She was unspeakably sorrowful, and she continually sighed, "Oh, my son, my son." When she came to the back gate of that palace where she had first seen Jesus passing with the cross and where he fell, she was so agitated by the painful remembrance that she too sank to the ground. Her companions thought her dying. They removed her to Sion, upon which the caniculum was still standing, and in one of whose buildings she took up her abode. For several days she appeared to be so weak and so near death that her friends began to think of preparing her a tomb. She herself made a choice of a cave on Mount Olivet, and the apostles had a beautiful tomb built there by a Christian stonecutter. Many were of the opinion that she would really die, and so the report of her death spread abroad. But she recovered sufficient strength to journey back to Ephesus, where a year and a half later she did indeed die. The tomb prepared for her on Mount Olivet was ever after held in reverence. In a later period, a church was built over it. John Damascene, as I was told in a vision, wrote from hearsay that the Blessed Virgin died in Jerusalem and was buried there. Her death, her assumption into heaven, and the sight of her tomb, as I believe, God has allowed to be subjects of uncertain tradition, that the pagan sentiments of the time might not penetrate Christianity, for the Blessed Virgin might otherwise been adored as a goddess. The vision of Anne Catherine when the apostles arrived to be present at the Blessed Virgin's death is next. And Catherine spoke. As the Blessed Virgin felt her end approaching, in accordance with the directions of her divine Son, she called the apostles to her by prayer. She was now in her 63rd year. At the time of Christ's birth, she was in her 15th. Before his ascension, Jesus had made known to his most holy mother what she should say at the end of her earthly career to the apostles and some of the disciples who should be with her. He also told her that she should bless them and that it would be conducive very much to their welfare and eternal salvation. He also entrusted to her certain spiritual labors for the general good, which being accomplished, her longing after heaven was to be realized. Jesus had at the same time made known to Mary Magdalene that she was to live concealed in the wilderness and that Martha was to establish a community of women. He added that he himself would always be with them. At the prayer of the Blessed Virgin, the apostles received, through angels, an admonition to repair to her at Ephesus. In the various places in which they were, they had erected little churches here and there. Many of them were constructed merely of plaited rods or branches covered with clay, but all were of the same form as Mary's house, that is, three-cornered in the back. They were provided with altars for the celebration of the Holy Mass. The journeys of the apostles, so distant, so exceedingly remote, were not made without divine assistance, although they themselves were perhaps unconscious of it at the time. Yet I do not doubt that they passed through many dangers in a supernatural manner. I often saw them walking unnoticed through the midst of a crowd. I have likewise seen that the miracles wrought by them among the various pagan nations were very numerous, and of a different kind from those recorded of them in the Holy Scriptures. They labored everywhere, according to the particular needs of the people. I saw that they carried about them the bones of the prophets or those of the first Christian martyrs, which relics they placed before them in time of prayer or when offering the holy sacrifice. When called to Mary, Peter was in the region of Antioch with another apostle. Andrew, who had shortly been before in Jerusalem but had been persecuted, was not far from Peter. I saw them both on their way to Ephesus, at places not very distant from each other. They passed the nights in those open inns that are met along the roads in hot countries. As Peter was lying one night near a wall, a resplendent youth approached him, took him by the hand, and bade him arise and hasten to Mary. On the way the youth said he would meet Andrew. Peter, who had grown stiff from age and fatigue, rose to a sitting posture and, clasping his hands around his knees to support himself, listened to the angel's words. Then he stood up, put on his mantle, girded himself, took his staff, and started on his journey. He soon came up with Andrew, who had been called by the same apparition. After traveling some distance, they were met by Thaddeus, who also had received a similar warning. They journeyed together to Mary, with whom they found John. Jude, Thaddeus, and Simon were in Persia when they received their summons. Thomas, who was in stature thick and short and had reddish brown or auburn hair, was of all the apostles the farthest off. He arrived only after Mary's death. When the angel came to call him, he was praying in a hut built of reeds, with one very poor, simple servant. I saw him sailing alone in a little boat far over the waters. Then he journeyed across the country, turning aside from all the cities. A disciple now accompanied him. Thomas was in India when he received the warning. Before receiving it, he had determined to go into Tartary, but he could not bring himself to change his plans. He always wanted to do so much, therefore it was that he was often behind time. So he started northward, almost across China, where Russia is now. Here he was called a second time. He obeyed the summons and hurried to Ephesus. The servant with him was a Tartar, whom he had baptized. Thomas did not return to Tartary after Mary's death. He was pierced with a lance in India. I have seen that he set up a stone in this last named country, upon which he knelt in prayer, and upon which the marks of his knees remained impressed. He told the people that when the sea would reach that stone, another would hear preach Jesus Christ. John had shortly before been in Jericho, for he often journeyed to Palestine. He usually abode in Ephesus, however, and the country around. Bartholomew was in Asia, east of the Red Sea, and he was active and handsome, his complexion fair, and his forehead high. He had large eyes, black curly hair, and a short, crisp beard, black and parted on the chin. He had already converted a king and all the royal family. Paul was not summoned. Those only were called that were related or acquainted with the Holy Family. Peter, Andrew, and John were the first to receive the Blessed Virgin's house. She was already near death. She was lying calmly on her couch in her sleeping place. I saw the maidservant looking very sorrowful in this and that corner of the house, also outdoors where she prayed, prostrate with outstretched arms. I saw also 2 of Mary's sisters and 5 disciples coming together to the house. All looked tired and exhausted. They carried staves of various kinds, each according to his rank. They wore, under their hooded mantles of white wool, long abs of the same material, fastened all the way down the front with little leather straps, slit in the middle over little rows, like buttons. Both mantle and alb were girdled high when traveling. Some had a pouch hanging from their girdle at the side. They embraced each other tenderly when they met. Many wept from mingled feelings of joy and sorrow at meeting on such an occasion. On entering the house, they laid aside their mantles, staves, pouches, and girdles, allowing their white robes to fall in broad folds down to their feet, and each put on a white girdle inscribed with letters which he had brought with him. Then, with deep emotion, they drew near Mary's couch to salute her, though she could now only say a few words. I did not see the travelers taking anything on their arrival except some kind of beverage from a little flask with which each one came provided. They did not sleep in the house, but outside, under light awnings which were put up on the post against the walls, about which were divided off and enclosed by movable screens and wicker work. I saw that the first to arrive prepared in the front apartment of the house a place suitable for prayer and offering the holy sacrifice. There was an altar covered with a red and over that a white cloth, and on it stood a crucifix, white, like mother of pearl, and in shape of a Maltese cross. The cross could be opened. It contained 5 compartments, likewise cross-shaped. The middle one held the most blessed sacrament, while the others were intended respectively for chrism, oil, cotton, and salt. It was not quite a span or 9 inches in length. Each of the apostles, when traveling, carried one like it on his breast. It was in this cross that Peter took to Mary the Holy Communion, during which the reception of the apostles stood, bowing low, ranged in 2 rows from the altar down to her couch. The altar, before which was a stand with rolls of scripture hanging over it, was not in the center of the front apartment where the fireplace stood, for that was still in use. It was placed near the wall on the right and was put up and taken down every day. When the apostles went all together into Mary's little sleeping chamber in order to take leave of her, they wore their long white albs and broad mantles. The screens that separated the front from the back of the house had been removed. The disciples and the holy women remained standing in the front apartment. I saw that Mary sat upright, that the apostles knelt in turn at the side of her couch, and that she prayed over each and blessed him with her hands laid upon him crosswise. She did the same to the disciples and to the women. One of the latter, who stood quite bent in 2 over Mary, received an embrace from her. When Peter stepped up to the couch, I saw that he had a roll of scriptures in his hand. Mary then addressed them in a body and did all that Jesus had in Bethania directed her to do. I saw also that she told John what was to be done with her remains, and that he should see that her clothes were divided between her own maidservant and a maiden in the neighborhood who came sometimes to render her service. As she spoke, she pointed to the press or petition, and I saw the maid going to it, opening and closing it. The journal now covers the death, burial, and assumption of the Blessed Virgin. And Catherine spoke, and now the altar with its covers, one red, the other white, was placed in front of the crucifix of the Blessed Virgin's own oratory. Peter here celebrated the Holy Mass with the same ceremonies as I had seen him first observe in the church at the pool of Bethsaida. Tapers, not lamps, were burning on the altar. Mary was in a sitting posture on her couch during the whole celebration. Peter was vested in the large mantle and the pallium, whose colors glanced from white to red. These he wore over the white robe. The 4 apostles assisting him were also vested in vestal mantles. After the communion, Peter gave the Blessed Sacrament to all present. During this holy Mass, Philip arrived from Egypt. Weeping bitterly, he received the benediction of the Blessed Virgin, and after the others, the Blessed Sacrament. Peter bore the Blessed Sacrament to Mary in the cross hanging on his breast, and John carried on a shallow dish the chalice containing the most sacred blood. This chalice was white, small as if for pouring, and of the same shape as used at the Last Supper. Its stem was so short that it could be held with 2 fingers only. Thaddeus now brought forward a little incense basin. Peter first gave the Blessed Virgin the last anointing, just as that sacrament is administered at the present day. Next, he administered Holy Communion, which she received sitting up without support. Then she sank back down on her pillow, and after the apostles had offered a short prayer, she received the chalice from John, but not now in so upright a position. After communion, Mary spoke no more. Her countenance, blooming and smiling as in youth, was raised above. I no longer saw the roof of her chamber, and the lamp appeared to be suspended in open air. A pathway of light arose from Mary up to the heavenly Jerusalem, up to the throne of the most holy Trinity. On either side of this pathway, I saw clouds of light, out of which gazed angelic faces. Mary raised her arms to the heavenly Jerusalem. Her body with all its wrappings were floating so high above the couch that I could see under it. A figure of light, also with upraised arms, appeared to issue from Mary. The two choirs of angels united under this figure and soared up with it, as if separating it from the body, which now sank back upon the couch, the hands crossed upon the breast. Many holy souls, among whom I recognized Joseph, Anne, Joachim, John the Baptist, Zachary, and Elizabeth, came to meet her. But up she soared, followed by them to her son, whose wounds were flashing light far more brilliant than that which surrounded him. He received her and placed in her hand a scepter, pointing at the same time over the whole circumference of the earth. At last I saw, and the sight filled me with joy, a multitude of souls released from purgatory and soaring up to heaven. And I received the surety that every year, on the feast of Mary's Assumption, many of her devout clients are freed from purgatory. The hour of Mary's death was made known to me. Peter and John likewise must have seen the glory of Mary's blessed soul, for their faces were turned upward. But the other apostles were kneeling, bowed to the ground. The body of the Blessed Virgin lay radiant with light upon the couch, the eyes closed, the hands crossed upon the breast. All present knelt, adoring God. At last, the women covered the blessed remains with a sheet, put all the furniture of the house aside, and covered it, even covering the fireplace. Then they veiled themselves and prayed together in a space in the front of the house, sometimes kneeling, sometimes sitting. The apostles, too, enveloped their head with the scarf they wore about their shoulders and ranged in order for prayer. They took turns, two at a time, to kneel and pray at the head and feet of the blessed remains. I saw them exchanging places with one another 4 times in the day, and I likewise saw them making the way of the cross. Andrew and Matthias were busy preparing the place of burial, which was the little grotto that Mary and John had arranged at the end of the way of the cross to represent the Holy Sepulchre of Christ. It was not so large as Jesus' tomb, being scarcely as high as a man, and was surrounded by a little garden, hedged in by stakes. A pathway ran obliquely down into it, and the stone couch, which was like a narrow altar, was hollowed on top to the shape of a body. Enveloped in its winding sheet, the head being a trifle higher than the foot. The station of Mount Calvary, the crucifixion, was on a hill nearby. No cross was erected on it, but there was one cut on the stone. Andrew was especially active in preparing the grotto and setting up a door firmly in front of the tomb proper. The blessed body was prepared by the women for burial. Among them, I remember having seen a daughter of Veronica and John Mark's mother. They brought spices and pots of fresh herbs in order to embalm it according to the Jewish custom. They closed the house and worked by the light of lamps. They opened up the apartment, back of the fireplace and removed the screens that enclosed the little alcove used by the Blessed Virgin as a sleeping place in order to have more room for their work of embalming. The wicker screens of the alcove were not again replaced, for immediately after the obsequies, they, along with those of the clothes pressed, were put out of sight by the maidservant. Only the altar was allowed to remain standing before the crucifix in Mary's sleeping apartment. The whole house had now become a little chapel in which the apostles prayed and celebrated the most holy and unbloody sacrifice. While the women were preparing the holy body for burial, the apostles prayed, choir and choir, sometimes in the front apartment, sometimes outside the house. The women went about their task most devoutly and reverently, just as had been done when preparing the most sacred body of Jesus for burial. The body of the Blessed Virgin was lifted in the linen of the deathbed and laid in a long basket, which had a lid and which was filled with covers, so that when lying on them it rose above the edge. The body was of a dry, indescribable whiteness, as if shining with light, and of so little weight that, like a mere husk, it could be raised quite easily on the hands. The face was fresh and blooming. The women cut off some locks of hair to keep as relics. They laid bushes of herbs around the neck and throat, under the arms, and in the armpits. Before the holy body was shrouded in its white garments and enveloped in the winding sheets, Peter celebrated the unbloody sacrifice on the altar of the oratory and gave Holy Communion to the other apostles. After that, Peter and John approached the body in their mantles of ceremony. John carried a vessel of oil, with which Peter anointed in the form of a cross, and with accompanying prayers, the forehead, hands, and feet of the holy body, which was afterwards entirely enveloped in linens by the women. They placed on the head a wreath of flowers, white, red, and sky blue, as a symbol of Mary's virginity, and over the face a transparent veil, through which it could be seen, encircled by the wreath. The feet also, which were bound up in aromatic herbs, could be traced through the linens that enveloped them. The arms and hands were bound crosswise on the breast. Thus prepared, the holy body was laid in a coffin of snow-white wood with a tightly fitting arched cover, which was fastened down at the head, the foot, and in the middle with gray straps. The coffin was then laid on a litter. Everything was done with utmost solemnity, and all were penetrated with deep emotion. The sorrow of the mourners was more human and more openly expressed than at Jesus' burial, at which holy awe and reverence predominated. When it was time to bear the coffin to the grotto, 1/2 hour distant, Peter and John raised it from the litter and carried it in their hands to the door of the house, outside of which it was again laid on the litter, which Peter and John then raised upon their shoulders. 6 of the apostles thus carried it in turn. The coffin hung between the bearers, as in a cradle, for the poles of the litter were run through leather straps or matting. Some of the apostles walked before the coffin praying, and after it came the women. Lamps or lanterns on poles were carried. Before reaching the grotto, the litter was set down. 4 of the apostles bore the coffin in and placed it in the hollow of the tomb. All went, one by one, into the grotto, where they knelt in prayer before the holy body, honoring it and taking leave of it. Then the tomb was shut in by a wicker screen that extended from the front edge of the tomb to the top of the vaulted wall above. Before the entrance of the grotto, they had made a trench, which they had planted so thickly with blooming flowers and bushes covered with berries that one could gain access to it only from the side, and that only by making his way through the underwood. On the night following the burial took place the bodily assumption of the Blessed Virgin into heaven. I saw on this night several of the apostles and the holy women in the little garden praying and singing psalms before the grotto. I saw a broad pathway of light descend from heaven and rest upon the tomb. In it were circles of glory, full of angels, in the midst of whom the resplendent soul of the Blessed Virgin came floating down. Before her went her divine Son, with marks of his wounds flashing with light. In the innermost circle, that which surrounded the holy soul of Mary, the angels appeared like the faces of very young children. In the second circle, they were like those children 6 to 8 years old, and in the outermost, like the faces of youths. I could clearly distinguish only the face, the rest of the figure consisting of perfectly transparent light. Encircling the head of the Blessed Virgin like a crown was a choir of blessed spirits. I know not what those present saw of all of this, but I saw that some gazed up in amazement and adoration, while others cast themselves prostrate in fright upon the earth. These apparitions, becoming more and more distinct as they approached nearer, floated over the grotto, and another pathway of light issued from it and arose to the heavenly Jerusalem. The blessed soul of Mary, floating before Jesus, penetrated through the rock and into the tomb, out of which she again arose, radiant with light in her glorified body, escorted by the entire multitude of celestial spirits, returned in triumph to the heavenly Jerusalem. The next day, when the apostles were engaged in choir service, Thomas made his appearance with two companions. One was a disciple named Jonathan Elazar, and the other a servant from the most remote country of the 3 holy kings. Thomas was greatly grieved when he heard that the Blessed Virgin was already buried. He wept with an abundance of tears, quite astonishing to behold, for he could not forgive himself for coming so late. Weeping bitterly, he threw himself, with Jonathan at his side, on the spot upon which the blessed soul of Mary had left her body, and afterward knelt long before the altar. The apostles, who had not interrupted their choir chanting on account of his coming, now gathered around him, raised him up, embraced him, and sat before him and his companions bread, honey, and some kind of beverage in little jugs. After that, they accompanied him with lights to the tomb. 2 disciples bent the shrubbery to one side. Thomas, Eleazar, and John went in and prayed before the coffin. Then John loosened the 3 straps that bound it, for it rose high enough above the trough-like couch to admit of being opened. They stood the lid of the coffin to one side, and to their intense astonishment beheld only the empty, winding sheet lying like a husk or shell and in perfect order. Only over the face was it drawn apart, and over the breast slightly opened. The swathing bands of the arms and hands laid separate, as if gently drawn off, but in perfect order. The apostles gazed in amazement, their hands raised. John cried out, "She is no longer here." The others came in quickly, wept, prayed, looking upward with raised arms, and finally cast themselves on the ground, remembering the radiant cloud of the preceding night. Then rising, they took the winding sheet just as it was, all the grave linens and the coffin to keep as relics, and returned to the house by the holy way, praying and singing psalms. When they entered the house, John laid the folded linens on a little flap table before the altar. Thomas and the others were in prayer, but Peter went a little apart, as if pondering some mystery. After that, I saw him celebrating divine service at the altar before Mary's crucifix, and the apostles standing in order behind him, praying and singing. The women were standing in the doorways and by the walls of the fireplace. The young servant that had come with Thomas looked quite unlike any of those present. He had small eyes, high cheekbones, forehead and nose remarkably flat, and his complexion was brownish. He was already baptized. He was perfectly innocent and obeyed orders simply. He did all that he was told, remaining standing or sitting wherever they told him to do so, turned his eyes in any direction, indicated to see whatever was pointed out to him, and smiled upon everyone. When Thomas wept, he wept also. He always remained with Thomas, and I saw him dragging immense stones when Thomas was building a chapel. I often saw the apostles and disciples standing together in circles and relating where they had been and giving their experience. Before the apostles left Mary's house to journey again into distant parts, they rendered the grotto of the tomb wholly inaccessible by raising an embankment of earth before the entrance. At the rear, however, they made a low passage to the back wall of the tomb proper, and an opening in the wall by which one could look down upon it. This passage was known only to the holy women. Above the grotto, they built a chapel of wood and wickerwork, and hung it with mats and tapestry. The little altar consisted of a stone slab. The step, too, was of stone. Behind the altar hung a strip of stuff which was sewed or embroidered quite simply in the colors of her festal robes, a picture of Mary. The little garden in front of the tomb, and especially the whole of Mary's way of the cross, was beautified by them. While engaged in this task of love, they prayed continually and chanted psalms. The apartment of the house in which Mary had her oratory and sleeping alcove was converted into a little church. Mary's maid continued her abode in the front part of the house, and 2 of the disciples were left there by Peter for the benefit of the faithful dwelling in that section of the country. The apostles, with tears and embraces, took leave of one another after they had celebrated once more a solemn service in Mary's house. An apostle or disciple often returned at different times to pray there. I saw also that here and there, out of devotion and in reverence to the Blessed Virgin, churches were built by the faithful in the same style as her house, and that her way of the cross and her tomb were for a long time devoutly visited by the Christians. You've been listening to Truth of the Spirit and Mary's Last Days, narrated by Patti Brunner. You can read this episode at patriarchministries.com/200. If you have enjoyed listening to the Journal of Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, please click like and leave us a comment down below. We invite you to subscribe to our podcast or YouTube channel. It's free. And then come back for more. With the Holy Spirit, there's always more. Amen.
This is the Padua Podcast Network. PaduaPodcastNetwork.com